Good afternoon, amazing people. Welcome back after the break. Hope you had a very nice lunch. My name is Elena Sobolevska. I am working with Accenture Baltics in Riga for 20 years. We've been, and in Lithuania, we are working for 1 year. So, for any questions, you can always find me on LinkedIn. But here today, I am to introduce Phil Wilkins. Hello, Phil.
Hi, good
How are you
afternoon,
doing?
everyone.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
It's Phil is coming from England, and it's always a must to say, to ask how are you, and yeah, most people still care. So Phil, you used for sunny weather, aren't you?
Yeah, it's not too bad out today.
It was a joke. I was supposed you will laugh. Yeah, the sunny day ruined it for me. So 25 years in software industry. How do you feel?
Sometimes very old and other times very young. Depends on
Very.
where I'm working and who I'm working with.
And what do you think about ChatGPT and all that stuff with your experience?
With my experience, I don't have too much dealings with AI, but it's certainly making some significant advances. So pretty interesting.
I just can't imagine stepping into your shoes when you started IT 25 years ago with like all those big machines, no internet, and now there's ChatGPT and all this AI that actually does so much for you. And I think it's crazy like to actually experience that.
It certainly is. Um, and it seems to get faster every year.
When I Googled you, I was very impressed with your Amazon listing that you are the writer. I've seen that you have 3 books under your name. So, are you a millionaire with all this success?
I wish. I wish.
But it's really impressive, and thank you for all this work, for sharing your knowledge. And I will definitely buy one of the books because I always feel kind of special when I connect to the author, and then I want to have this book to actually read it and have it. And today, Phil is talking about APIs and what makes good async and REST APIs. Phil, the stage is yours.
Lovely. Thanks very much. So, this is me, and we've just talked about the books. There's just a few of them. All of this content is that we're going to be going through today is available online, so don't worry about trying to grab notes as we go. You can find all this content on my social connections that are just under my picture there. This is just standard Oracle stuff, just so that you can't blame me and I can't get into trouble for anything I say. So let's press on. We're all pretty familiar these days with APIs, and a lot of us, when we're working with APIs, tend to focus on the payload, but our API is more than just a payload definition. So we've got APIs everywhere. And various flavors from GraphQL and gRPC to SOAP and WSDL if you're old enough, RAML, and so on. Now, when it comes to API definitions and defining APIs, if we focus on just 2 areas, specifically the Open API spec, which people are more familiar with, and the up-and-coming asynchronous API spec, we can actually cover the definition, description, and communication for about 90+% of APIs out there. So in this session, whilst a lot of the ideas that I hope to put across will work for other areas, it will definitely apply to much of Open API and Async API. Now, one of the interesting things is questions is, what's the similarity? What are the differences between Open API and Async API? Why have we got 2 different specs? So let's just look at the structures of how we describe the two syntaxes. And you'll find there's a lot of commonality. So the basic information about the APIs, but what actually structurally they're the same. Hey, the details about the hosting servers or content servers you need to connect to for the API and the security for those things is commonly or very similar in its definition. We can create references to additional documentation, metadata tags, and things like that. They're all the same in both specs. Both specs have a components construction, which we then put our schemas into. So whilst the internals of components differ a little bit, there's a lot of commonality inside that block as well. And yet both have summary and description information, slightly different positions in the structure, but the same definition. And our operations are very, very similar. Rather than using the HTTP verbs, we're using publish or subscribe syntax. And then whilst in HTTP and REST for OpenAPI, we talk about requests and responses. In messages, we talk about headers and payloads, which, as anybody will tell you, still got the idea of headers in HTTP as well, and you're dealing with a payload in your HTTP body. Just a little bit of differences in flexibility and what the payload could be. So hopefully you can see there's a lot of commonality there. So as we go through, I may focus on Async API, or I might focus on an Open API built, with the standard REST frameworks. But it should apply to both in most cases. Having said that, this is a lovely tool that's been built by Arnaud Lauret as Open API. It's a really good tool that allows you to navigate through the API specification and understand the different areas of the whole Open API spec. Today, there isn't an async version of this yet, but quite often, as you've seen, a lot of the definitions are going to be the same, and the idea of creating an async API version of this is floating around. So typically when we're looking at an Open API spec definition, we look at these areas, the get operation or the post operation and its attributes. We look at the path definition, and so on. What we tend to overlook when we're dealing with Open API, and it's quite unusual to see it, is some of these other areas. In an Open API, you can reference external documents. We can actually define the security rules for using an API. We can refer to a description that describes the terms of service or the license for using an API. And we can even add additional documentation links in here. So you can see here external docs, and it just says, look, give us a description, a URL of what the document is. We can set the terms of service. And we can talk about security requirements. But these fields, these attributes of an Open API are rarely used. Bit of a missed opportunity, in my opinion, as you'll see. Here's an example of an Open API spec with the security definition, and it's really straightforward. There's no rocket science, but it lays out very easily for people to read and understand what the permissions are and how to authenticate against the service. So really useful to incorporate into your API spec. So does it cover everything? we can see it, the Open API spec and the Async API covers a lot, but does it deal with everything? So what I did, what I started to do some years back now, when talking through APIs and supporting APIs, particularly when we were working with multiple third parties and helping customers develop APIs for other organizations, is that we expressed the idea of an API as a set of building blocks. And this is effectively all the building blocks together, and this has become nicknamed my API wall. You start at the bottom and you work up building layer upon layer. So you want your API to be safe and secure, and how can people understand and be assured of that? Then we need clear, consistent, concise communication in the contract, so we don't talk about addresses in several different ways. If we've got to carry on multiple addresses, we're consistent in the way we describe it. We think about using standards for our attributes. So if you're passing a locale information, think about the ISO standard for country codes and locales. We need to understand what the business value is. Then we move up into the how do people consume and utilize my API, the rules of engagement or terms and conditions, if you like, how to make it easier to consume. And that then decomposes into a number of areas, such as how to test, the T's and C's, the authentication, authorization, and so on. Now, a lot of people say to me, but Phil, that's brilliant if you're publishing the API for the outside world, but what about the fact I'm building internal APIs only? I don't need that. Well, actually, I'd argue that you should still consider it. The reason being is we don't want to all be supporting our APIs forever. We want to move on to new projects and products at some point in our career. We all want to move on, but at the same time, business and software needs evolve over time. So our APIs are going to change. So we need to enable people to understand and to support them. And the last thing you want is people badgering you all the time about simple things about your API. The other thing to consider is how do we control and manage the utilization of our APIs? So introducing API gateways for not just what's described as north-south use cases, that's the external use cases, but east-west, that's internal between different departments or different teams, is worthwhile. And then to an extent, and we're seeing this steadily evolve, if you're working with Kubernetes, you will see things like Envoy and Service Mesh technologies starting to support that. And in fact, you've got Ambassador being built on top of or extending Envoy to almost become a lightweight API gateway. Now, the benefits of using the API gateway is you can now understand where people are using it, what people are doing with your APIs, and you can start to think about measuring and justifying expenditure and investment in your API. If lots of people are using it, then obviously there's value in extending and developing and looking at different ways of utilizing it and leveraging the information on how are people using your API, what are they using it for, and that will allow you to make it better and better. And it's not just about you, of course. You can use it to support your security team. If you're working with an organization that's adopting a platform style team, the information can be used by them to better understand it. That's all great. What I've described fits REST use cases brilliantly. But if you're doing async APIs, message-centric APIs, an API gateway is not going to fit there. Or is it? Well, actually, the idea is not that dissimilar when you're dealing with a brokered asynchronous communication, which is covered by your async API definitions. Go through a message broker and try and centralize it, or at least go through a proxy layer, and you will be able to start to capture and manage the same sort of information. You can start to see which message queues, which topics are being used, who's using them. More advanced brokers will allow you to authenticate and authorize your consumers and providers. And if you use a centralized service, you get that visibility. You've got a single point that you can manage more effectively, and therefore eliminate or reduce the risk of points of failure, because you can set up the clustering and resilience a lot more robustly. But how these capabilities, the use of a broker or a proxy or the API gateway, doesn't fit very well into the API spec, whether that's an async API or an open API spec. So, if we're not dealing with those questions, as I alluded to, you will get bothered by people wanting to know how to use your endpoints. How do I test it? How do I express my date or my date of birth? Is it a US format? Is it UK format? Is it, if it's a currency, which currency are you using? How do I express the currency? How do I get my credentials to self-serve? And then, as I say, they're not well addressed necessarily in the core documentation, which means that we need to think about approaching it slightly differently. And of course, we want to move into the world of self-service. We use self-service for our everyday activities. When you self-serve, when you're doing your banking and all of that, you don't phone your bank manager up to say, I want to shuffle some money from here to here, or I want to change my password. So all of this sits around your API, your API spec. And there are a number of other things that we can do to make life easier. We can eliminate the need to necessarily understand some of our APIs by putting an SDK around it. If you put your SDK in place, then all of a sudden understanding the API becomes understanding a programming framework. For most developers, that's business as usual, particularly if you're supporting multiple languages. So coming back to my external world, we can now look at it and think about it from an internal perspective. And a lot of this still holds true. SDKs, well, for internal use cases, people working within the same organization more likely to be familiar with the core technologies a company uses. But that is becoming a little bit grayer as we move into the world of microservices, and people will accept polyglot style development a lot more. So SDKs are still handy. Test frameworks, fantastic, and still very important. And you'll see in a moment why we should be providing a test framework and communicating in supported documentation how to find this, how to use the test framework. You might still want to express some commercial factors because there's still considerations there, particularly if you're cross-charging within an organization and so on. And regardless of where you're connecting, whether it's purely internal, we ought to be doing some basic authentication and authorization in this day and age, particularly if your API is dealing with sensitive data. So let's look at some strategies and ways of solving this and bringing to bear on our API definition, API implementations. Some techniques to help us develop and address the needs. So what can we do? Well, you can start, you can build your own variation of the wall and then work out which bricks you want, which are important to you, which are less important, and then make sure you're addressing those when you build APIs. Ideally, within an organization, you agree what bricks in that wall are important to you and how to address those bricks so that you've got consistency in the way you're communicating. At the end of the day, we all want to work in a fairly consistent way. We want to be able to go and find the information that we need and know that we only have to search in one place. You don't want a situation where some people are putting docs into just GitHub or into Git repo, and others are using a wiki of some sort, because that just makes it really hard. Use tools. There are a lot of tools out there that will help us. A lot of them are open source, and it's more than just designing the API spec. There are tools that will create mock endpoints to make life easier for people to start testing it against your API and confirming that their code works correctly before they even come anywhere near your production deployments. So sharing those development and test links is always a really good place to be. Providing all the additional documentation to answer these questions, whether it's marked down in the repo or something else, absolutely ideal. Or even better, wherever you deploy that documentation, put the links into the spec as we saw. The specs support the idea of pointing to additional documentation. Try avoid burying details in big, heavy Word documents. Hundreds of pages of Word document is the fastest way to put people off. And they'll just go, I'm not reading all of that. I'm going to ping somebody the question. And when you're working on the content, think about and try and put yourself in the shoes of your consumer, and not just address how to use it correctly, but what would the user expect to see when things don't go right? Because we all make mistakes, we're all human. So helping people understand why things are going wrong is always a plus, and that will save you a raft of questions coming in, and people reaching out and saying, hey Phil, I'm trying to use your API, but it keeps throwing a 500 error, and things like that. If you get asked the same question more than a couple of times, then it's a candidate for adding to your documentation, because then at least you can say, read the manual when people are badgering you and you're trying to meet your next deadline. Developing your APIs and your API specification using an API first model is going to save you a world of time and help you get that communication right. And this is true not just of RESTful based APIs, but any API, even it's a message centric API. Designing the schema, designing and defining the paths, the queues, or whether it's Kafka or JMS if you're into Java, or GraphQL, all of that. If you do solve and work with potential candidate consumers or people that understand the consumption use cases, it's going to help you. And then what you can do, of course, is you can set up a mock endpoint, and then you can develop your backend whilst they're developing the client. And that just makes life for everybody so much easier. So, API first is well documented, it's well expressed and written about, and it's well worth adopting as a model. And APIs, supporting APIs and doing a good job of API documentation and all the supporting resources around the API spec is really powerful. There are plenty of use cases where organizations have been enormously successful through their APIs. Walgreens, the US chemist, if you like, is a really good example. Some years back now, they introduced or rebuilt their ability to print photos in their stores. And they exposed the APIs to their print service publicly. Just more of the origins were that they started out as just an experiment because they already had the APIs internally. They exposed it, and all of a sudden they found that the people were building apps on mobile phones and things like that, so that you could, in the app, take a photo and send it to a store to be printed. And they saw a massive growth in their usage of that service as a result. So, whilst we may be thinking internally or primarily focusing on internal use cases, the opportunities for growth are phenomenal. And who knows, you may become I used to say Elon Musk, but given what's happening with Twitter at the moment, perhaps maybe look at someone like Stuart Butterfield, who founded Flickr. And how important is all this supporting information beyond just the payload? Well, looking at API reports out there, 2021 State of API report, 27% considered documentation one of the most important things to see happen. Here's another measure, 34% of customers will upgrade if they find or extend their use of APIs if they find it helpful. So business growth. Here's just a raft of press cuttings and headings. And you'll notice, whilst most of them again are focused on API in the REST space, they are also starting to pick up on that async. You can see there at the top the reference to the future of IoT just here. So it is just as important in the async space as it is in the non-async use cases. Here's some more stats. Last year, another report, still very important, fourth most important subject. Consumers of APIs, only 50% of API consumption comes from a tech dev background. The other half of consumers are semi-technical or non-technical in terms of being roles other than devs, architects, citizen developers, CEOs, CTOs, people that are not working with APIs on a day in, day out basis. They're not wanting to plow through reams of code to understand how an API works. Investment. There you go, 53%. Documentation, 64% say it matters. Number one in the list there. Another aspect of things that we should be considering is, APIs evolve. So we should be thinking about how we annotate our APIs for versioning. In REST, most people tend to use the URI, but there are multiple options. And again, even in async APIs, we need to consider it. The payloads in our messages will change. So do we put into the root of the payload definition an API version? If we're using gRPC, that's got mechanisms for versioning. Explore these and then importantly communicate them so people understand how they work and how you're using them. And think about the OWASP risks, the top 10. So we all know about OWASP for our application development and the top 10 vulnerabilities that they've identified over time. But actually, we can apply this to APIs. And OWASP actually did an API version of their top 10. To be honest, most of the issues are pretty similar. They're just in a slightly different order. And many of these apply whether it's an async use case or synchronous use case. Yeah, and a lot of them we can solve by using good design or a gateway or a more advanced broker, or even just a proxy to help us monitor the traffic, which comes back to that architecture I was showing earlier, where we're using a shared proxy point to give us abstraction and the awareness and monitoring of what's going on. I talked about the SDK. There are plenty of tools out there to help us build SDKs. In fact, it's pretty unusual these days not to have an SDK in a generating capability in a commercial API product. And the Async API initiative includes a generator which will generate code for you off your Async API specification. So that can help if you want to create mock endpoints for async endpoints. You can use your SDK and just wrap a little bit of extra code around it, and then you'll have a mock in no time at all. And here's just a few tools that will do it for you. These are more REST focused, but API-Matic, I think, are now supporting Async API, and as I say, the Async API initiative has got generators. So let me take what I've just been through and talked about, and I want to just highlight these points. This isn't just my opinion. I had evolved these viewpoints and these practices over a number of years of consulting and working with customers and internal teams and so on. But let's just have a look at a well-known API and see how it fits. Okay, so I went to Google Maps. Everybody knows Google Maps. Yes, it is a big API, it's well established, but it's important. And it's a good example. It's easy to highlight the points. Here you go. I've talked about SDKs and the API. There you go. They've given you the different SDKs for different platforms, as well as the API. Makes it adoption easier. They've explained the big picture and all the documentation to go around the use of the API, how to self-serve, understanding the consumer and explaining the expectations of consuming the API, so that you got your readers understand what's needed to be able to master it. You'll notice in the block that they talk about versioning in there. They explain how to do the usage of it, what's paid, what's not. What are the requirements for using the API, what the rules of engagement are. Make it self-service. Okay, now all of these are good points, and people think, well, I'm using the HTTP and REST calls. Actually, this is a good example for async API, using the async API approach as well, because all of Google's APIs are offered through gRPC, which is not covered by async API by OAS today. It's because it works differently. It's not using the core HTTP syntax as part of the API definition. So there's an illustration of how it's relevant to both. So what does it mean here. Yep, my little Oracle pitch. I'm just going to fly through this. Oracle supports all these ideas and needs with various Oracle tech. This is my little sales pitch. And there we go. Right, just some useful stuff. Lots of stuff about Oracle, and this is all free. This is no sales pitching or any of this. Lots of details about use of APIs and asynchronous APIs out there as well. Now, it gives me a few minutes to address any questions, if there are any that have been raised.
Hello again. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I really felt myself in the place when you told, I'm not reading that huge documentation. I need a person to ask my question. Yeah. And I was like, yes. And that's all those support tickets to Atlassian and stuff.
Absolutely. And that really was where the experience, my personal experiences are coming from.
We don't have any questions in the chat, so that means everything was explained very, very well. And I always say, explain it to my 5-year-old or to my mom. And if it's in that level, then, you don't have any questions like, yeah, that's true. That is, I understand.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be reams of documentation. It's about making it focused and make sure you understand the consumer.
Yes, and then that's the most important part, to make it easy, to make it usable. So thank you very much. It was, I think it's a very important topic, and it was very valuable.
Lovely.
So if we don't have any questions, I'm telling you a very, very big thank you, and say hello to a new king from us here in Baltics.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. It was a pleasure to meet you. Bye.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Take care.
This is all we got. Remember the revolution in our minds. This is all we got.
Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and high on illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, but I'm just a human. Oh, we don't need to say we're sorry. We don't need to worship ever stars. We don't need to say we're sorry. So where's the love?
This is all we got. Dreaming about a revolution in our minds. This is all we got. Talking about resolutions, getting high. We don't need a lot, and we don't care if we fuck it up. If it's what we got, then why not give it all we got?
See in your eyes you're defeated. Try to fool yourself till you believe it. That you're better off not men not feeling. But there's a sky if you jump through the ceiling. Oh, we don't need to say we're sorry. We don't need to worship ever stop. We don't need to say we're sorry. So where's the love?
This is all we got. Dreaming about a revolution in our minds. This is all we got. Talking about resolutions, getting high. We don't need a lot, and we don't care if we fuck it up. If it's what we got, then why not give it all we got? Then why not give it all we got?
Then why not give it all we got?
This is all we got. Then why not give it all we got? This is all we got.
Then why not give it all we got?